Hello, everyone. Welcome along. Good to see some of you already out there already tuning in. Oh, we've already got our first question. Fantastic. Well, welcome along to this live stream on learning and on research methods. I've been emailed some questions already about these topic areas that I've been planning to answer. And I see that Blake is out there. Hi, Blake, and thanks for your question. That's actually a really good question. We might as well start with the big picture about stats. So Blake's asking if in future subjects there will be more education on statistics. Yeah, there is. So mind, brain, and behavior one sets the foundation, and we've focused on research methods and then just descriptive statistics. In mind, brain, and behavior two next semester, you will still have access to all of the research methods modules from this semester and some new ones, which will explore what are called inferential statistics. So these are statistics that allow us to go beyond more than just describing what we have in a given sample, and to be able to do some statistical analysis to make some inferences about whether or not we observe, whether or not what we observe in the sample is likely to hold for the population from which that sample came. We'll be able to make determinations about whether, actually, we'll be able to statistically investigate a lot of the research questions that you learned about this semester, things like association, whether two things are related. We can test that with a statistical procedure called a correlational analysis, and that will test the strength of an association and the direction of it. We have talked about research designs that involve looking at group differences. And for example, if we conceived a randomized control trial to test a medication, a new treatment, or a psychotherapy, we could get a group of people to receive just the control condition, an experimental group to receive the treatment, and then we could compare those groups on the level of whichever symptomatology we're interested in. If it was depression, then great, and we could index depression with a measure, and we could work out the average or the mean, the mean as a definition now. Incidentally, of course, probably an important definition to remember for the exam. So we would take the mean of each group and use something called a Ttest to compare those two group means and see if they are statistically significantly different, and that would tell us about whether or not the same effect is likely to hold in the population more broadly. And we'll also learn to interpret things called effect sizes and confidence intervals and a whole range of sort of fundamental aspects of inferential statistical analysis, which form the foundation for psychological scientists to be able to do research and then interpret those findings and infer something about the broader issue, the broader population at large. So yes, that's what we'll do in mind, brain, and behavior too. And then in each subject throughout second year, you will build incrementally on that foundation with, again, more research methods modules. So there are going to be more modules that you encounter with each subject, and you'll always be able to go back and access the previous modules as well in time. We're going to make these available via a central LMS site that's available to all psychology students on demand. So you'll always be able to come back to the Mind, Brain, Behavior 1 stuff or the Mind, Brain, Behavior 2 stuff to refresh your mind as you take the next step. Then in third year there is a research methods subject, which is about more advanced research methods techniques and statistical techniques. And so in the careers AMA that I did recently, I talked about the statistical critical thinking and research methods skills of psychology students being very appealing um, to employers. And hearing now, I think that you're going to be doing stats as you go throughout your psychology major and future psychology subjects, and that there is an entire third year subject about stats. And in fact, if you go on to fourth year, then surprise, surprise, there's another more advanced multivariate statistics semester-long subject. And if you go into master's or a PhD, believe it or not, there is yet more research methods and statistics to come. So it might not feel like it right now, but certainly either by the end of this year, you'll have a really great foundation, and it will just get better and better with each subject that you take. And even though it might be unfathomable for you right now, by the end of this, you are going to be pretty good at stats. So everybody that's tuning in, if you have any questions, please feel welcome to post them in the discussion section in the chat room here. So I hope that answers your question, Blake. Thanks for asking that one. So I've been getting some questions about research method modules 7 and 12. They're going to appear in the next few days just for your interest, but they're not examinable. So the research methods modules that are examinable, good stuff, Blake. The research methods modules that are examinable, spit it out, Christopher, are the ones that are there already, 1 through to 6, and then 8 through to 11. So that covers absolutely everything that you need to know, and you will be able to ace the exam for research methods just by watching the modules. The readings and the quizzes are going to be helpful, and actually I was just finishing uploading all of those just when the stream started, so I'll finish that right after the stream. But the readings will be great, and it will certainly help your understanding, and I always encourage you to do the readings, and then you'll be able to test your knowledge via, the quizzes, and I suppose if you haven't even started on the research methods module stuff much yet, you've still got 2 weeks to go until the exam, don't you? It being on the 14th. So you've got a little way to go yet. In fact, while I'm looking at my calendar, why don't we set up another live stream for next week while we're all in the same space? I won't be able to do it Thursday, but I can do it Wednesday. So let's set up another 11 a.m. Live stream, which can be another general exam and research methods and learning AMA, or just a general AMA. All right, so that's in for 11 a.m. on the 6th. And I'll make an announcement about that. Okie dokie. So again, anyone, if you've got any questions, please feel welcome to post them up in the chat room. Alternatively, I might start talking about some of the questions that I've been asked, and they've been around learning, actually. So let me address a couple of the questions that I've been asked about my learning lectures. I've got one, which is actually a really good question, and one email from who are we here? Email from L has asked what the difference between classical, operant, and social conditioning is, if you had to say it in really simple terms. So if we think back to my lecture series, it's very easy to make a general distinction between classical, operant, and social learning. So if you remember, with classical conditioning, we are talking about a process where there is a reflexive situation initially. So there's going to be some sort of natural response that we have to some sort of stimulus. So it might be a loud bang, and we might have a startle and fear response, for example. If you think back to Pavlov, of course, his initial observations were about salivation from dogs in response to the presentation of meat. So basically, classical conditioning is where we pair in time and in space a previously neutral stimulus with that unconditioned stimulus that can naturally elicit a response, and then over repeated pairings, but not necessarily. Sometimes it happens in just one go. If we're talking particularly about something that's conducive to survival, that we would need to learn quickly, we see that previously neutral stimulus take on the ability to elicit a response, and that is the conditioned response. When it begins to elicit a response, we call it then a conditioned stimulus, not a neutral one, and it's eliciting a conditioned response that, for all intents and purposes, is very similar to the unconditioned response that we saw in response to the unconditioned stimulus in the first place. So classical conditioning, put simply, is about pairing of a previously neutral stimulus with a stimulus that can naturally elicit a response, and then that stimulus, that neutral stimulus, takes on the power of that unconditioned stimulus to a point to elicit a response. It's about pairing in time and place. The difference with classical conditioning and operant conditioning is that operant conditioning requires behavior to be performed, and then a consequence happens after that behavior. And as a result, behavior is thought to increase or decrease. So we've got some interesting distinction here, I suppose, in terms of time. With classical conditioning, that neutral stimulus should co-occur with the unconditioned stimulus, or occur right before it, basically the same time. We're talking about association, again, in time and space. With operant conditioning, we're talking about a behavior being performed and then things that happen after the behavior. That's what you need to think about. With operant conditioning, it's all about consequences of behavior, and the consequences of behavior that's performed by an organism will influence whether or not that organism performs the behavior again, or doesn't perform the behavior again, or performs it more often or with greater magnitude, or less often and with less magnitude. With social learning, and we think to Albert Bandura here, we're talking about similar process to operant conditioning, but the organism itself doesn't need to be performing behavior. We can observe somebody else. A model, if you remember, is the correct term. So the theory goes that you can observe a model perform behavior and observe the consequences of that behavior for the model, and you can learn vicariously by observing those consequences of behavior for the model. And if the model was reinforced for performing a certain behavior, for example, it's more likely that you would express that same behavior. If the model was punished, then it's going to be less likely that you express that behavior. And so that's really, I suppose, the difference there between operant and social learning. If you want to disentangle those, think about who is actually doing the learning. With operant conditioning, it's the organism itself. With social conditioning, it's not the organism itself. The organism is watching somebody else get conditioned, essentially, and is learning vicariously. Okay, we've got some questions in. Good morning, Ewan. I will start addressing these questions, and I'll put the other ones that I've been sent on hold just for the moment. Good morning. In what way will the question for the research methods be asked? Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a variety of types of questions that I will be putting forward in the exam for the research methods component, and I want to answer your question precisely. So I am pulling up the exam on my screen right now. Who wants to see it? So let me just cycle through to the research methods component of the exam. Given there's going to be some definition questions, and you should be able to define, I mean, not, this is a multiple choice exam, right? So you just need to circle an answer. But what you need to be able to do in your mind is know the definition and the description of any particular thing that I've talked about. So if I have talked about, for example, a confounding variable, you should know what a confounding variable is. What is a confounding variable? You should know what a hypothesis is. You should know what a mean is, what standard deviation is, what the median is, what the mode is. You should know each of these various things. What are they? What do they do? So that if I ask you a question about the definition, you will be able to answer it in any particular way that I ask. So if I asked you, I could ask you a question that might say something like, what is the definition of the mean? And then provide you with a number of alternative answers. Or I could be slightly more tricky and say, which of the following measures is equivalent to an average? Or I could be even more tricky and say, which of the following measures is a measure of central tendency, and maybe set up a question where the mean was the only thing in the list that was a measure of central tendency. I might, and let's stick with the mean, right? So we've talked about the mean a little. We'll keep going with it. I might ask you questions about the mean and how it relates to other things. So I might ask you, for example, if you had, if you were using a mean as a measure of central tendency, what type of measure of variability would you use in association with that, for example? I might ask you about when the mean might be a good choice to use as a measure of central tendency, or when it's not. Now, I don't know if you've watched, I think it might be Descriptive Statistics 1, maybe Module 9. If you haven't watched that already, do, and observe that everything that I've just said is actually answered in just that video. Again, if you go and read more and you reflect on the tutorial class that you had in association with the video, then great. But you will be able to answer everything that I just mentioned if they were exam questions just on the basis of the video. So, sorry, bear with me here. So yeah, there's going to be definition questions. There's going to be questions where I show you something and I ask you to tell me what it is. So maybe I'll show you a type of distribution. Maybe I'll show you something from SPSS in terms of output from SPSS, and I ask you to tell me what it is. Basically, you'll just need to know what the concepts are that I've presented in the subject, and what their definitions are. Not need to calculate anything in this statistics part of the exam, in this research methods component of the exam. It's the first year that this has ever happened for psychological research methods. We're focusing here on your conceptual understanding of how things like means and standard deviations, for example, work. And certainly we've talked through how standard deviation is calculated and why it's calculated in the way it is in Module 10, I think it was, Descriptive Statistics 2, where we talk about variability and measures of variability. And so my aim for you with this exam is to be able to demonstrate your conceptual understanding of what we've presented in the research methods modules and the associated tutorials. So don't worry about, oh, yes, I've received a couple of emails asking me about whether or not you need to take a calculator. No, you don't need to take a calculator. We have instead focused not on manual calculation, but on conceptual understanding, and of course, being able to understand and there will be some, I suppose, trickier questions where I ask you to apply your question. There will be various types of ways in which I in which I can ask about your understanding of the research methods component of the course and the content. So I think if you just aim to listen to the modules as your foundation, identify what the core things that are being presented in the modules are, make sure you understand what they are, you're going to be fine. This is going to be a very low stress component of the exam. I hope that helps you and Z. Blade, cool name, Blade. Hey, Chris, roughly how many questions in the exam will be devoted to research methods? I can tell you precisely, Blade, there will be 30. There are 30 questions in the exam devoted to research methods. And specifically, these are questions 91 through to 120 on the exam. So the exam is presented in sections, 5 sections. In turn, there will be behavioral neuroscience with 30 questions. There's, what's going on here? Sorry, I'm just cycling up. So 30 questions from behavioral neuroscience, 30 questions from sensation and perception, 10 questions from my lecture week on learning and conditioning, 20 questions from Meredith on language and cognition, and then the 30 from research methods. That's good, UNZ. I'm glad to hear that helped. I hope that helps, Blade. So yeah, the 30 questions from the research methods. Hi, Katie. What's the difference between descriptive, correlational, and non-experimental? Very good question. So with descriptive designs, we're just looking to describe what is there. We're not making any attempt to draw links between different types of variables as we are with correlational designs. And with correlational designs, of course, we are seeking to test the we're seeking to test or set up a situation where we could test a relationship or an association between two different types of variables. With non-experimental designs, this is sort of like Oh, questions. This is sort of like an experimental design where we've got different groups and we're trying to compare them. And an experimental design is really that type of design that you need to be able to infer causation with something. You really want to, well, it's part of what you need to do to infer causation, have an experimental design. But with a non-experimental design, there's going to be some attempt to control for confounds, that is, variables or factors that would influence your ability to be able to draw that causal direct link between the independent variable and the dependent variable in your study. And certainly, sorry, bear with me. I've got questions coming into me by email as well. Okay. But with non-experimental designs, it will not be possible most commonly to have all of the stringent controls that a fully randomized experimental design would have. And most often, the place in which a non-experimental design not necessarily falls down, and I'll come back to that point, but the place in which it does not have equivalent rigor to a full experimental design generally is in terms of random allocation to participant groups. Sometimes it's not possible to randomly allocate people to participant groups for the sake of a research project. Sometimes it is. And these days, what we actually like to see is a hierarchy of evidence that includes both evidence forthcoming from experimental designs and non-experimental designs. And non-experimental designs, if we think about clinical psychology, and if you're testing a treatment, for example, or an intervention, non-experimental designs are quite often in the form of what we call pragmatic clinical trials that are delivered in the context of everyday mental health service delivery. So to give you an example of a non-experimental design project that was testing a therapy, I ran a clinical trial a few years ago that was testing the efficacy of modalities of delivering therapy for suicide prevention. And when I say modalities, I'm talking about whether a special type of counseling was effective in reducing suicidal behaviors and thoughts when you deliver it face to face, or you deliver it via the telephone, or you deliver it via video chat like we're doing now, or you deliver it via text-based chat. So I don't know if I've told you guys, but I used to run some really large mental health services for Australia, some national suicide prevention services. And I know you've probably heard of Beyond Blue. And I used to govern the online clinical services for that, for example, but other things like suicide callback service, Suicide Line Victoria, Men's Line, all the Defence Force stuff, and veteran stuff and whatnot. And for the suicide callback service, for example, we're developing a new suicide prevention service, and we wanted to see how this service would incorporate text-based, video chat, telephone call based counseling. But this was really new at the time, and we didn't know how that worked specifically for people who were having thoughts of harming themselves. Now, think about the ethical implications here. it wouldn't be appropriate to force somebody to receive counseling through a particular modality that they didn't want to engage in when they're in crisis and they're in a place where they're thinking about suicide. That would not be ethically okay. I needed to give people their choice. So in that case, the research methodology was restricted by the context of the mental health service and the nature of the service. And it wasn't possible to randomly allocate people to groups because that wouldn't have been ethically okay. People needed to have their choice. But that's okay because non-experimental designs, I've just been talking about sorry, I just misread your, I just realized that I've just misread your question. Sorry about that. So I've been talking all this time, of course, not about, I've got so many windows open. Hang on, let me find you again. Where's your question? Okay, so you've asked about non-experimental designs. Sorry. I've been talking about quasi-experimental designs this whole time. I've got them confused in my mind. Sorry. I've been talking about quasi-experimental designs. So we're talking about everything I've just said still holds, but take out where I've been saying non-experimental, insert quasi-experimental, and that is what I meant. So quasi-experimental designs, if I can finish off that previous story with the correct terminology, are really useful because they tell you about how well what has been established in an experimental design and a fully randomized experimental design works in the real world. So it gives us a pragmatic source of evidence to complement that very tightly lab-like controlled circumstance that you see in a fully experimental design. Now, in contrast, non-experimental designs don't try to control anything. So sorry, let me draw this distinction for you. Non-experimental designs are not trying to control anything. They are just observing a variable, and they are they are concerned with just description of maybe groups on a single variable, and maybe just observation, but there's no experimental manipulation here. With correlational designs, we're in contrast going to be drawing relationships between variables. So and maybe that's the distinction you're asking about. So with correlational designs, we're looking at multiple variables and typically one group, but with a non-experimental design, we're looking at a single variable most typically, and we might be comparing, say, two groups with a single variable and just really describing what's going on. The experimental design you're asking about, that is the one that's really concerned with establishing cause and effect, not necessarily just there being a relationship as you would with the other designs between variables, or in terms of comparing groups on a single variable. Lots of questions coming through by email. The experimental design is that one that's really concerned with establishing cause and effect. And the requirement is, and if this wasn't clear before in terms of the distinction I was making between quasi-experimental and experimental, the requirement for the experimental design is that there is random allocation to groups, and you're eliminating any bias that could have influenced how people get into groups that could then otherwise explain the results. Wow, look at all these questions coming through by email. Okay. Oh gosh, all right, hang on. I'll put them on hold for the moment and I'll come back to the chat online first. So I hope that answered your question in a very long and roundabout way, Katie. Incidentally, if you're curious about what I was talking about um, in terms of online and telephone based interventions for suicide, those things that I was testing are actually now a service. And if you ever interested in or concerned about somebody that you think might be at risk of suicide, you can always look up a website. It's called the Suicide Callback Service. You can just Google that, and that's one of the services that I used to run. Vincent. Hi, Vincent. Hi, Chris. Where can I get an approved dictionary for the exam? Bilingual dictionaries are approved by default for this particular exam. I've set the exam up so that you don't need to get a permission slip. You just need to get a bilingual dictionary where you could get that from a bookstore. I'm not sure. A bilingual dictionary. I don't know. Where would one get one of those? A bookstore. There may be some in the library that you can get out, but that's typically not the type of book you'd be able to take out for a long period of time from the library. I hope that helps in some way, Vincent. Oh gosh. Okay, look at these questions. Okay. Okay. So again, another question here, asking about the different types of research designs. So if I think back, I think we covered 5 primary types of research design. So we would have talked about descriptive designs, which are again just about description, observation, and description of individual variables. That's all a descriptive design is about. The correlational design would be maybe the next one that we talked about, and that is again about relationships, looking for associations between different variables, but not inferring causation. That's not the role of correlational designs. They're just there to establish a relationship exists. Quite often, you might do a correlational design before going on and doing one of those more cause and effect type designs. Actually, along those lines, somebody sent me an email a little while ago asking me if it's just regression, a statistical procedure called regression that you would use to demonstrate cause and effect. And no, it's not. There are many more things to do. Regression is a statistical procedure where you test whether, to put it very simply, whether or not you can predict an outcome based on a set of scores that you might have, or whether one set of scores could be predicted on the basis of another set of scores, or how much variability in a certain set of scores you can predict based on that in another set of scores. There's a few different things you can do, and you'll learn about regression in the future. But no, if you really want to get at cause and effect, there's a lot of stuff that's involved with just fundamentally research design, and experimental designs are the things. So that would be like the third of those 5 types of research designs that we've talked about. The experimental designs, that's random allocation to groups, really carefully, tightly controlled experimental designs. So I actually have an experimental design in the REP. at the moment that has been quite controlling um, allocation to experimental conditions, and you'll see probably my study and other studies also using some of the controls that I talked about in the research methods modules, including, so if we think about um, the academic problem of sampling for research, I talked about the idea of probability and non-probability sampling. Probability sampling where you know the precise characteristics of the population that you're going to draw the sample from and the precise probability of any individual being chosen for your sample is known. And then there's non-probability sampling, which is less ideal, but more often the case of what you actually have to do pragmatically, which can be influenced by bias, but there's a number of things you can do with non-probability sampling in terms of controls to control against bias. And one thing is to do quota-based sampling to make sure that your sample ends up being representative of whatever population it is that you've drawn from. And one thing you'll note in the REP system menu is that studies may have been periodically changing which sex, for example, they're asking for. Sometimes you might see studies asking for a period of time for just people who identify with a male sex or a female sex, for example, or both, for example. And they will change that over time to make sure they're hitting quotas and keeping their samples balanced so that sex couldn't end up being a confounding variable. So that's probably a good opportunity to say that they're controlling for the extraneous variable of sex. So extraneous being having potential to otherwise explain your results, and confounding being if it actually turned out that we did see a relationship between sex and your results and it could explain your results. We'd say the results are, confounded potentially by that particular variable of sex. So listen to me, I like to waffle, don't I? But we're just sort of ad-libbing, I suppose, around their experimental designs. I don't think I need to ad-lib around quasi-experimental designs anymore. Again, we're talking about groups, but we're talking about groups where we're talking about less control, no random allocation generally, and probably people are in those groups because of some characteristic that is of interest for the study as an independent variable. So I've certainly done, and that quasi-experimental design that I was talking about certainly had the technological modality conceptualized as an independent variable for the study. So there were outcomes that measured suicidal behavior and thoughts, for example, and we certainly looked at, based on people's choices of allocation to computer or telephone or whatnot, how people's scores on those measures varied as a function of the type of technology through which the counseling was delivered. So that's quasi-experimental designs. Non-experimental designs, again, yeah, we're talking about relationships, but we're talking about a single variable and probably two groups. And we're not trying to infer causation. So they are the 5 different types of research designs that we covered in this particular module from memory. So I hope that helps, Justin. I hope that answers your question. Let me flip back to my web page and see what's happening. Hey, Chris, just got here. Welcome, oh Snow. I'm just going to call you Snowman from now on. But is there, um, look at me attributing gender, Snow person. Hey, Chris, just got here, but is there content based on certain experimental designs, match pairs? No. So the exam will not ask questions about anything beyond that which I have explicitly talked about in the modules and that which we explicitly covered in the tutorial content. Snow person, was it you that asked me about Jordan Peterson the other day? I think it might have been. And I said that, I didn't really know anything about him. Well, I have begun my foray into Jordan Peterson's work. And look, really interestingly, I have quite a few points of intersection, I suppose, with his work. We're both interested clearly in hallucinations. We're both clearly interested in psychiatry and clinical psychology. And I'm not to the controversy yet, I suppose. So I've started by listening to some of his lectures around hallucination and around some fundamental issues with clinical psychology, and this has all been very sort of standard stuff that I've encountered so far. I'm just starting to get to the point now where I'm starting to delve into the controversial stuff, which in no small part seems to be around freedom of speech, which is a really interesting issue. I'm not there yet, so I can't really give you my opinions just yet, but certainly I haven't come across anything unusual just yet. Not that my opinion really matters, right? But yeah, I just thought I'd let you know that I was following up on that, following the previous discussion. If that was you, Snow Person, I think it was, but it might not have been. So let me have a look at these other questions and just shut these various windows I've got so I can find them more easily. Feel free to find more questions up there on the discussion board, everyone, by the way. Okay, so what's the difference between extinction and learn inhibition? Oh, okay. All right. So I've got a question here about learned inhibition and the difference between extinction and learned inhibition. Okay. So if we take our minds back to the classical conditioning component of the learning week, and this was my first lecture, and you think back to again, this idea that classical conditioning is about learning by associations and pairing of a previously neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus, it becomes a conditioned stimulus and can elicit a conditioned response. So we've got a question here about what the difference between learned inhibition and extinction is. It's not really a difference per se. It's just what learned inhibition is. It's a concept that has got convergent evidence to support it, which suggests that when we break that link, when we extinguish a classically conditioned link between a conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus, such that that neutral stimulus that became an unconditioned stimulus again becomes unable to elicit a response. And that would happen when you repeatedly present the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus, and it loses its power. That's what we call extinction, if you remember. But the concept of learned inhibition is that is pointing out that you didn't lose the association when extinction took place. Organisms don't unlearn. It's not forgotten per se, the link between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. The link is inhibited. We learn to inhibit the response. And you might recall that there were two types of evidence for this. There was spontaneous recovery, which occurs when, after a period of extinction, where you repeatedly present the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus ever occurring, and the conditioned response stops. A period of time elapses. Oh, I just spat on the screen. Sorry, everybody. A period of time elapses, and then you will see that if you offered the previously neutral, then conditioned, and then weakened, extinguished stimulus again, you would see the conditioned response offered again. So it hasn't been forgotten. It just hasn't occurred for a period of time. It's actually been inhibited. And you might also remember the concept of rapid reacquisition. And rapid reacquisition refers to this phenomenon where it's much easier and quicker to condition that neutral stimulus the second time around. So if you do the pairing association of the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, and then the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, it elicits a conditioned response, and then you present the conditioned stimulus repeatedly without the unconditioned stimulus ever occurring. You do the extinction, and then you leave that alone. If you try to pair the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus again, to again strengthen that link again, you find that it happens much quicker the second time around, which tells you that there's a trace there. There's a trace that there was an association beforehand. The learning is still there. It's just been suppressed. So extinction isn't different to learned inhibition. Learned inhibition is just explaining what happens when extinction occurs. It's not that everything is lost, it's that it's suppressed or inhibited. We learn to inhibit it. Itchy nose. Okay, let's have a look at these questions. Oh, that's not for you. That's for my other third year subject. Okay, so I think I've pretty much, in my various ramblings, touched on the questions that I'd been emailed. Actually, there's a couple of things I might just mention in passing. So don't forget, the deadline for REP participation is tomorrow, end of tomorrow, 5 p.m. Got to have it done by then. There are studies that still have time slots, and you can still go ahead and sign up for research, although they're becoming fewer and further between, I suppose, because all of the time slots are being booked out, but there still certainly are some studies available. I've also just been sent a question about what happens if I've fallen short of the attendance hurdle for Mind, Brain, and Behavior 1. So to be eligible to pass the subject, you do need to fulfill the attendance hurdle requirement. But if you happen to fall short of it during the semester and you didn't attend 80% of the tutorials, then don't worry. We will assign you a small writing task so that you can complete that task as a make-up task to make up for falling short of the hurdle requirement, and you will still then be eligible to pass the course as soon as you have completed that make-up task. The way that will happen is that Caitlin Gourlay, the head tutor, will be in touch with you in the next little while in the lead up to the exam, if that applies to you. If you hear nothing, you don't need to worry. Okay. Hi. Oh, I'm so bad with pronouncing names. Saida? I'm going to call you Saida. Actually, let me call you Fizzer. I like Fizzer. That's a cool name. So, Fizzer. Saida Fizzer? Give up, Chris. Okay. No, there's no calculations. All good. No calculations. Don't have to worry about calculating anything. You don't need to take a calculator. In fact, don't take a calculator. They won't let you have it. And there's no need. So there are no calculations in the exam. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but there's nothing to calculate. You will need to read some SPSS output. You'll need to know your concepts. Fizz is good. All right, Fizz, sounds good. Now, I'll let you. Fizz is actually one of the words in one of my new favorite drinks. When I was in Venice earlier this year, I went to a bar called Harry's Bar, which is a really famous bar where Truman Capote and Ernest Hemingway and all these guys used to hang out. And the Bellini is the drink to have there, but I also had what's called a gin fizz. So very cool name there, Fizz. And yeah, don't worry, no calculations in the exam. You're going to find the stats component of the exam or the research methods component of the exam perhaps far less stressful than you might imagine. So we've been going for nearly an hour, but have I really been rambling for an hour? Gosh, I can talk, can't I? How are there any other questions out there that anybody would like to ask while you've got me here? You have me. I'm your captive audience. Nothing else is really coming to mind that I need to say. But as a reminder at the start of this discussion today, hi Alice, you're extremely sad that you got 2 tests next week, so you only have a week to revise for psych. Gosh, that's a lot to try and cram in all at once, isn't it? Man, yeah, that takes me back to my undergraduate days, and having to prepare for different tests all at the same time. That's a challenge. I suppose if it's any help, the way that I used to do it is to really try and I suppose do what I mentioned in a previous live stream and adopt that very metacognitive approach to preparing for the exam and think about each particular exam and what I wanted from that exam in terms of marks, then thinking about, based on my current level of knowledge, how likely it was that I was going to attain those marks. And for me, for psychology, I wanted the highest marks possible every time. If it wasn't a psychology subject, then I didn't necessarily want the highest marks possible, although I generally have that streak, so I sort of did anyway, but it wasn't as important to me. So there's, I suppose, the distinction between what I'm talking about there, between what you'd ideally like, how important it is to you, what is likely to happen based on your current knowledge, and then what you need to do to get to that place where you're feeling confident that you'll have the outcome you want. And that will help you schedule your time as you head towards the exam. Again, my best tip for those of you who are pinched for time when you're preparing for the psych the Mind Brain Behavior 1 exam is to think about the realistic situation, which is that each lecturer can only ask about 3 questions from each lecture, which means you should start by finding out what the 3 most important things in each lecture are, learn what they are, and then move on to learn the other bits as you can. Again, you can only do what you can with the time available. I suppose that's a really good thing to keep in mind. You can only do what you can with the time available. So, I certainly understand that you're all under incredible time pressure. Um, be realistic, I suppose, and try to look after yourself in the middle of the pressure of studying for your exam. Hi, Joseph. Uh, okay, so I talked a little bit about SPSS already, but basically, you don't need to know menu systems or anything like that. What you should know with SPSS is how to read output that might come out. And who knows, that might be a table, or it might be something that would be presented in a table. It might be a figure. Who knows? But yeah, know how to learn how to read output. There will be something about SPSS. I'll just tell you, there's going to be some sort of SPSS output in the exam that you will need to interpret. And it is the type, you've encountered this output before in one of the self-guided SPSS exercises that I wrote for you. And because you've got access to SPSS through my uni apps, you can have a practice at any time that you like. Fizz, that sort of answers your question as well. There's certainly going to be a question that asks you to look at something that's come out of SPSS and asks you to interpret it. I'm glad that helps, Alice. So I was about to say, for those of you who have joined us late in the stream, that I have set up a time for another stream next week, and it's going to have to be on Wednesday, because on the Thursday I will be looking after my third-year students at their exam. Of course, you guys don't have your exam until the following week. So on Wednesday, the 6th of June at 11 a.m., I will come online for another just general Ask Me Anything. And this could be about the exam generally, about research methods, about learning, and so forth. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else I need to tell you right now. I did get one question earlier on today about the REP data and why people can't see their credits in LMS. The way this is going to work with REP is that after Friday, all of the researchers will finish putting their data in the REP system, and that's the SONA system that you have signed up to and where I've approved your accounts when you've gotten in there. And that data I will take and I'll combine it with the data from Grade Center from the LMS, which is the scores for your assignments, and the attendance data, and then that will all be combined to arrive at your score for Mind Brain Behavior 1 overall. So the reason you can't see your REP data in the LMS is because it will never actually end up there. It's a behind the scenes sort of thing that we will be doing, but you can take to the bank that if you've whatever credits you have got in the REP system, the SONA system, up to a maximum of 5, you will get them towards they will translate into credits for Mind Brain Behavior 1. So, for example, if your Mind Brain and Behavior 1 score including the exam, assignment 1 and assignment 2, came to a total of 75, and you did 5 hours of research experience, you'll get 5 credits, and your final score for Mind, Brain, and Behavior 1 will be 80. That's okay, Fez. You can always email me a question in advance if you have one, and the recording of the live stream will be available as well. So if you want to send me a question in advance, um, you can always watch the live stream when you have got time. Oh, can I quickly explain how that works? Can we download SPSS onto your own computers? Okay, let me have a look here. Haven't been to the My Uni Apps site for a while. Okay, so my advice to you is just to Google. Oh, actually, you know what? Hang on, just one moment while I see a very interesting link. Okay, hold on one moment, and I will post this link for you in our comments section. Acacia, have a look at that link there, and that will take you to the library guide about SPSS and how you can access it as a student. And there's also a link to My Uni Apps there, and it's actually a web-based version of SPSS, so you sort of use it while you're online. If you are interested, oh God, this is the worst idea to be saying, but I don't want to confuse you. But if you want a free statistics program, you can look for a statistics program called JASP, JASP. It's a different type of statistics program in the entire undergraduate and graduate program of psychology. At this point in time, we will never teach you anything about JASP. But if you want a free statistics program that you could just play around with data with, in addition to SPSS, you could look that up. It's one of a number of statistics programs out there, but just never confuse it with anything that we're doing in coursework. We are going to be using SPSS for all of your psychology coursework for the undergraduate program, for sure. You're very welcome. Okay, so what else could I say? I think that's probably all I can think of saying right now. Oh, certainly, please, if you are yet to complete the subject experience survey for this subject, I'd really appreciate it if you do. You know by now that this is my first year taking over this subject as the coordinator, and I'd be really grateful to you for your thoughts. I've certainly changed things up quite a bit by giving that early assessment, that week 4 assessment, which was designed to decrease the size of the big assignment that came later on, and also give you an early idea about how you're doing. We've changed the research methods component, the learning lectures have changed. There's been a lot of changes. While the university is cracking the whip at me from above to get people to respond to the survey, I am also genuinely interested in what you think and whether or not you feel that you've had a good learning experience, because that's certainly something I want to give you and future students. And anything you care to give me feedback about via that SES survey will be really useful for building an even better iteration of Mind, Brain, Behavior 1 next year in 2019. Oh, thank you, Ice Speed. That is very nice. Okay, everyone. So I think that's probably all the questions we'll answer for today. Thanks so much for tuning in. And if you're watching the recording later, thanks for tuning in and watching the recording. Again, I'll be online on Wednesday again. And at 11 a.m. and feel free to send me any questions that you want me to talk about then, or tune in at that time and ask me some questions live. So thank you again, everyone, and all the best for your exam prep. And again, remember to look after yourself while you're going under all of the pressure of studying for your exams. Okay, everyone, take care. I'll speak to you soon.